Hi, everyone. How are you? I'm good, thank you. So we're going to talk about Katherine Swynford today, who Becky mentioned, and you'll actually hear some of the same people coming up in this presentation as Becky's awesome one. Okay, so we'll start with the basics. Who was Katherine Swynford? She was the queen mother to Henry IV. She was the sister-in-law of Chaucer, might have heard of him. Highest ranking lady in England actually for about a year because there was no queen. She was the Duchess of Lancaster as the wife of a prince. And she was the mother to a duke, a marquess, a cardinal, and a countess. She was possibly also the mother to an abbess, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. She was the grandmother to a Scottish queen and the great-great-grandmother to two kings. Now, she's Tudor-centric because she is Henry VII's great-great-grandmother, and it is actually through her that Henry got his claims through her Beaufort line. Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you. So, we don't know much about her early life, but she lived from about 1350 to 1403, and she's the direct ancestress to every monarch since Edward IV, including the current king. My notes still say queen. That's sure. So everyone since Edward IV is descended through her. Like I said, she's the forebearer really of the Tudor dynasty, and Henry IV actually referred to her as his mother during his reign. So she has a lot of historical ties, but without her, we wouldn't have any Tudors or Stuarts or any other preceding dynasty after that. So we'll start at the beginning. Like I said, we don't know for sure when Katherine was born, but probably around 1350. We think she was born in Hainaut, which is modern day Belgium, Netherlands. I kind of circled it there. That's a map of roughly what Europe looked like in the mid 14th century. So close to England, but still more of a Dutch territory. We know that she was the daughter of a knight, Pan de Roe, and we know that she had 3 siblings, a brother and 2 sisters. Now, her father, Pan, came to England probably when Katherine was little, and she probably came with him. And he came with the train of Queen Philippa of Hainaut, that is Edward III's wife. And he was highly respected by the royal family. They actually promoted him, and he comes up quite a bit in the history of Edward III's reign. And he was buried in Old St. Paul's Cathedral, the one that burned down in the fire in 1666. So that kind of signals his importance. So he was really beloved, but we don't even know who Katherine's mom was. She's not mentioned. Now, that picture looks familiar, but that's Edward III, and that's the tomb effigy of Queen Philippa. So when Katherine came to England, like I said, she was pretty young, and this was at the height of the chivalric age. This is when Edward III was really at the height of his power. The English had they won back a lot of French territories. They and won a lot of major battles, and kind of when you think of the medieval era, you think of knights and you think of a regal king and a humble queen, and Edward and Philippa kind of epitomized that. So we know that Katherine and one of her sisters named Philippa, now same thing, everyone has one of 5 names in this, so it's very confusing. There's Queen Philippa, but then Katherine has a sister, Philippa Roe. So her and her sister Philippa were kind of raised in the Queen's household. She was known to take in a lot of noble children into her house. She had 12 children of her own. And so it seems like Katherine and Philippa were kind of raised alongside her own daughters and were part of her household. And we think that Katherine's mother probably died when she was very young, and that's why there's no mention of her mom. And so Philippa, Queen, kind of acted as a surrogate mom to her. So she grew up kind of knowing all the ins and outs of the court. Court life is, that's where she grew up, and she was part of the royal house. So in a lot of ways, she had a more privileged life than a lot of other people of her typical class. So she would travel with the court palaces like Windsor, Westminster, and she would have been used to a pretty high standard of living, and she was probably a companion to the princesses. So we know that Geoffrey Chaucer was also held in high esteem by Edward III and some of his children. So it's her sister Philippa that goes on to marry Geoffrey. So the fact that they marry kind of signals her significance, and it kind of strengthens her ties to the monarchy, but she also strengthens his ties and helps in promoting him and his career, as we'll see. So at this time, Katherine would have known John of Gaunt, but he was about 10 years older, so they probably didn't spend a lot of time together. But they would have been familiar, they would have moved in the same circles, and she probably would have seemed more like a sister more than anything to him. So when she was about 15, we don't know for sure, probably somewhere around 1365, she married Hugh Swynford. So Hugh was a knight in John of Gaunt's retinue. So he was part of John of Gaunt's household. And by the time of Catherine's marriage to him, she was actually part of Duchess Blanche's household. Now, Duchess Blanche was John of Gaunt's first wife. So Katherine was part of her household, Hugh was part of John's household, and it was kind of common for knights and lower born noble women to marry each other, if they're from the same respective house of the lord and the lady. So he wasn't a very well-to-do knight, but he was respected, and he had 2 properties in Lincolnshire. One is Colby and one is Kettlethorpe. Kettlethorpe that was the nicer of the 2, and that's what you see in the picture. So the house that stands now, I think, is Victorian. There's not much that remains of anything from the medieval era, but the gatehouse right there, that is from Catherine's time. So if you imagine, that it would have been a little grander, maybe a wall around it, and then a house with probably a tower, stuff like that. That was Catherine's home. But her lifestyle would have actually taken a downturn when she got married, because she was used to living in palaces, and just her type of lifestyle would have actually kind of gone down a few notches. Kettlethorpe was pretty impoverished. The land there wasn't very good for farming and grazing, so the land wasn't very friendly to her, but she made the best of it, and she kind of moved into her role as Lady of Kettlethorpe, as she was known, pretty quickly, and in due course she started having children. Now we know for sure that she and Hugh had a daughter named Blanche, likely for Duchess Blanche, and we know that John of Gaunt was that daughter's godfather, as we'll talk about more, and that would actually have a lot of repercussions later on. We know that they had a son named Thomas, and he was born in February 1367. We know that because the births of boys were always kept track of, and the girls not so much. So there's evidence for a 3rd daughter named Margaret, but we don't know for sure that she was Catherine and Hugh's daughter, but it seems like she was. So she was given over to Barking Abbey at the same time as Elizabeth Chaucer. That's Chaucer and Philippa Roe's daughter. And she was appointed by Edward III himself to be an office at Barking Abbey. So it seems like she was a person of some significance, probably Catherine and Hugh's daughter, but we don't know for sure. And of course, there could have been other children that didn't survive childhood, but Blanche was betrothed to a Robert Davenport, and at some point around 1375, they think. But the marriage never took place, and we don't really hear much about her, so she probably died as a teenager. But Thomas did go on. He married, he had children. So they were a pretty typical, lower nobility family. Now, we've talked about John of Gaunt, but who is John of Gaunt? So Enter the man, the myth himself. So he's the third surviving son of Edward III. And Edward III was actually the first king to make royal dukes of his sons. And so the title that he gave John was Duke of Lancaster. And this was in right of his wife, Duchess Blanche. And so this actually made John the richest noble in the country after the king, even richer than the Prince of Wales, the firstborn son, and his older brother Lionel. So this family tree kind of it shows a little bit where the seeds of the Wars of the Roses were being laid. So, like I said, Edward III had 5 sons. They had seven, I think, and 2 of them died as babies. But the 5 sons were where the seeds were laid for the Wars of the Roses. And all the brothers actually got along with each other very well, but it was their descendants that ended up fighting for the throne. So the Black Prince, the father of Richard II, Lionel only had a daughter. Now she married one of the Mortimers, and I don't want to throw too many names out there, but it gets a little confusing. And so the Mortimers would eventually marry descendants of the Yorks, the 4th son of Edward III. And this is how they claimed that they had a better claim to the throne than the Lancastrians, because they had a claim through Edward III's 2nd son, but it was in the female line. John of Gaunt married 3 times altogether, and his first set of children, as I mentioned, were with Duchess Blanche, and so they became the Lancasters. His 3rd wife, Katherine Swynford, their children became the Beauforts, and so they both end up in the Wars of the Roses, but that just kind of shows you which line goes where it's not. It skips a few generations. So he was, John was extremely wealthy, extremely powerful, but he was also pretty resented. Let me see here. Sorry. So we don't know exactly when John and Catherine's affair began, but they did begin an affair after both of their spouses had died. So it was after Duchess Blanche died, and probably sometime around his 2nd marriage. Now, his 2nd marriage was to Constance of Castile, and she actually had a claim to the throne of Castile. Her father was Pedro the Cruel, and he was murdered, and I think an uncle usurped the throne. So she actually was the rightful queen of Castile. She was 17, so John decided to marry her, and that's why he claimed that he was king in right of his wife of Castile, and he pursued that. Well, Catherine's husband, Hugh, died in 1371, but he died 2 months after John had married Constance. So we know that the affair started after Hugh died, but we don't know what would have happened if Hugh had died before John married Constance. You know, it's possible that John might have married Catherine at that point. You know, we really don't know, but he did marry Constance. 2 months later, Catherine is widowed, and it seems pretty quickly after that, he appointed her as governess to his Lancastrian children and kept her around, and they started an affair, probably within a few months, probably not long into his 2nd marriage. So you'll see later that the timing of it with Hugh dying after the marriage with Constance is actually pretty significant. Let me see. So what we do know is that they were very attached to each other, John and Catherine, because their history went way back. They were, like I said, probably raised together, but at different age. And she was very close to his first wife, Duchess Blanche, and he was faithful, as far as we know, to Blanche. So she probably stood as a tie to the original Duchess, and she was also governor to his children. So she was like a motherly figure. So they came together, and they were kind of a comfort to each other. So Baroness Sarah Hogg actually, she lives at Kettleford. She's a baroness and a viscountess. And she said that someone said to her one day, Catherine's story is like Princess Diana. And she replied, no, she's Camilla. So and that's actually a comparison I had noticed. And historian Jeanette Lucraft has also made that too. So people might have mixed feelings about that, but you have to remember that, you know, John didn't know Constance. It was a dynastic marriage. People had to marry for certain reasons. Adultery is not okay, but you know, they were a comfort to each other. So that's the way it wound up. Let me see. So they had 4 children altogether. And we think that the first one, John, was born probably about a year after the affair started, actually born around the same time as John's daughter with Constance, who was named Katherine, which is weird because there's no Katherine in the Spanish family, there's no Katherine in the English family, so we don't know if Katherine Swynford was a godmother, if she was a friend of Constance's, but that's a whole nother story. So John Beaufort was their first son. And about 2 years later, Henry Beaufort came along. 2 years later, we think Thomas came along, and then 2 more years pass and Joan joins the family. And the reason why I put that slide up is because that is the Beaufort portcullis. And if you have the chance to go anywhere in England, like Westminster Abbey, Hampton Court, any palace, most cathedrals, you will see that portcullis everywhere. It's a royal symbol, but it actually originates from the Beauforts. That was their badge, and it began with them. So even to this day, the crown kind of, you know, harkens back to the Beaufort portcullis. Also, just quickly, why are they called the Beauforts? So they were his illegitimate children, and he didn't want their existence to kind of interfere with his legitimate son, who would want to be Henry IV. He didn't want them to interfere with his legitimate claims, so they couldn't be called of Lancaster. So he gave them the surname Beaufort. Beaufort is a castle that he had a claim to in France but never really owned. So it was kind of seen as like a non-threatening title that he could give his bastard children. So what was life like for Katherine? She was kind of the de facto duchess. Constance wasn't around much, maybe because her husband had a mistress and was living openly with her. But, you know, we don't know which came first. But Katherine was kind of the one that was front and center that traveled around with John. These are the remains of Kenilworth Castle, which is one of John of Gaunt's favorite residences. And if you see way in the background in the middle, those are remains of what's known as John of Gaunt's Hall. And it is, I mean, it is ruins, but it's still one of the largest surviving ruins, great halls in England. So he made a lot of improvements to the castle, but Katherine and him would have spent a lot of time there, probably had a lot of happy memories. He also loved his palace, the Savoy in London, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And they would have spent a lot of time there. By all accounts, it was the grandest palace in certainly England, probably Christendom. It was a huge palace. So, you know, she still had the role of governess, but that was kind of in a way a veil to be at his side at all times. So, and I guess that's a good way to, you know, fit her in. Why is she here? But they lived pretty openly, and that's where the scandal started, because a lot of nobles, if not almost all of them, had mistresses, had illegitimate children, but they lived very openly, and this started to draw more and more criticism, especially as John of Gaunt's popularity waned. You know, they were looking for, his detractors were looking for easy things to point out about him, and living openly with a mistress and disrespecting his wife, who he called the queen, is certainly one of them. So when she wasn't at his side, she was still known as the Lady of Kettleford, And she probably went there to give birth to her children, and she probably raised the Beauforts along with her Swynford children. Now, both John of Gaunt and Edward III endowed her with a lot of lands, a lot of gifts, a lot of money. But she didn't really take this to enrich herself. She actually made a lot of improvements to the house at Kettlethorpe, and what she was doing was increasing her son Thomas's inheritance. So she kind of used it for good, but there were always building projects going on at Kettlethorpe, which was her main residence. Colby not so much. Let's see. So Kettlethorpe, just to give you an idea, is, I think it's about 5 miles from Lincoln. That's a picture of Lincoln Cathedral, taken from Lincoln Castle. And the lands, they're about, I think 5 miles out. But Lincoln was still her hub when she wasn't with John, following him around. So she was building a lot of ties to Lincoln, which we'll hear about later, and even to the cathedral. Her and John were both very well connected. So I have to bring up Chaucer because he's Chaucer. So we don't know for sure what his relationship was like with Catherine, but we get some hints because at one point he does talk disparagingly about governesses with a past, and it seems like he's referring to her. We also can guess that his relationship with her sister Philippa, with his wife, wasn't good because he never dedicated any works to her, and he writes things such as in The Wife of Bath and the House of Fame, he refers to marriage as the trap of wedding, and he says that he doesn't know anything about love except for what he has read. And a lot of times his female characters are portrayed as nagging wives, and their husbands are kind of henpecked men. So we don't know for sure what Philippa was like as a wife, but it doesn't sound positive. So that may have had something to do with his feelings for his sister-in-law. He also really was devoted to Duchess Blanche, the first wife of John of Gaunt, and wrote the book of the Duchess about her. So it's possible that maybe he saw Catherine and John's affairs kind of disrespectful or a snub to her. But this is interesting because it was drawn in the early 1600s, so it was a long time after Chaucer was alive. But what's interesting is it's supposed to be the progeny of Geoffrey Chaucer. But if you notice, Pamela, that's Catherine and Philippa's dad, is at the top. Chaucer has his own wife as the daughter of Pam. Like, that's all he has. She doesn't even get a name. But he does list Catherine, his sister-in-law. And as you can see, he shows the descent of Catherine and John and their children all the way down. And like I said, this was made in the Tudor era, like late Elizabethan, early Stuart, I think. And so it kind of shows how he's related to the royal family, but that's all through Catherine. So it seems like maybe he wanted, again, this was a couple hundred years after his death, but someone had the idea to kind of emphasize his ties to the royal family, so maybe he promoted those within his own lifetime. All right, so the Peasants' Revolt. So to give a little background, this happened in the summer of 1381, and it was in response to several different things, but mainly people were really starting to resent John of Gaunt's power, and he raised a tax, and this was just not popular, and people saw his demands for money as being just something to enrich himself and to help him with his claim to the Castilian throne, which everyone was like, well, okay, so your wife was queen, but how are you king? But he still wanted to go be king. So they didn't like how their taxes were being spent. They didn't like that he was so rich and powerful. And so on June 13th, a mob stormed London, and their main target was the Savoy Palace that I mentioned before. And luckily, none of John of Gaunt's family was home. If they had, they likely would have been killed. So they killed many members of his retinue. They killed one of his priests, and it kind of turned into a bloodbath just all over London, and 1,500 people were killed by the time it was over. But they ransacked the Savoy, threw most of the contents into the river, and burned it to the ground. There was actually a storage of, I don't think it was gunpowder, but something that caused an explosion, and they accidentally blew the whole thing up while there were still people inside helping themselves to the wine. So not a good day. But this was kind of shocking. So John was in Scotland on a diplomatic mission, but he was shaken to the core. You know, he was this all-powerful man. He, at this point, Edward III had died, and his oldest brother had died. So his nephew, Richard II, was king. So he was kind of the only grown royal left. So he kind of felt like he was untouchable, but this just kind of shocked him. So his legitimate son, Henry IV, well, who would go on to be Henry IV, was Henry of Bolingbroke at this time, but he actually had to be hidden in the Tower of London so that the mob didn't get him. We don't know where Catherine was at this time. We know that she wasn't there. We also know that the Flemish people, which she was Flemish, were a big target of the mobs in the riots. There was a lot of ill will between the English merchants and the Flemish merchants. They felt like they were taking their jobs, you know, common thing that seems to go on. And they really targeted a lot of the Flemings. And so, like I said, if she had been there, she probably would have been killed, and or both her children. So the actual Duchess, Constance, she had to flee Hartford, and she went to Pontefract, and she was actually denied access to Pontefract Castle, and we don't know why. Some people have speculated that Catherine was there, and so they thought that might be awkward. But this poor Duchess is trying to flee from everything, and she has nowhere to go, and eventually she's allowed into Knaresborough Castle. So eventually she makes her way to Northallerton. And John of Gaunt, first he asks for Richard II to give his blessing for him to come back into the country. So that tells you something right there, because the fact that he thinks he has to actually ask the king's permission to come back into England shows you how frightened he is. He wants that validity. So Richard is 14. He grants him, you know, safe passage back to England. And John goes to Constance at Northallerton. And so upon greeting him, Constance begged John's forgiveness. Now it's kind of a weird thing, because, you know, why would she be begging his forgiveness when for the past 10 years he's been living openly with another woman? They have 4 children. But she does. And so she knelt down before him, but he actually raises her up, and then he begs her for her forgiveness. So this experience kind of shook them both to the core, and it seems to have kind of brought them together. They did still just have the one daughter, and we don't know where she was during all of this either, but her life by extension was also threatened. So for this reason mainly, John saw fit to repudiate Catherine. So on Valentine's Day, the following year, 1382, he actually signs what's basically a quitclaim to Catherine. It kind of relinquishes his right to any of the properties that he gave her, any of the gifts that he gave her, just basically saying what he gave her is hers, and he's done. And so he publicly says that, you know, he's going to change his ways, and it's kind of humiliating for Catherine, actually. So she doesn't have much of a choice. She goes to Lincoln, and we don't know why she didn't go to Guildford, but it could have been for her safety. So this is what is now known as the Deanery, where the Dean of Lincoln Cathedral lives, but at the time it was known as the Chancery, where the Chancellor lived. And this building is one of the few extant buildings that you can still go to that Catherine lived in, and it looks much the same as when she would have lived there. So at the time, the deanery was inside the cathedral close, so it was walled, and she actually lived alongside most of the clergy and the dean and the chancellor. So it was a very safe environment, and as I mentioned before, her and John had ties to Lincoln, so we don't know if maybe the religious were kind of paid off to allow her to stay there in safekeeping, because it is kind of odd that a mistress would be basically living in the cathedral close with the religious order, but that's where she wound up, and it seems like it was a safe place, and she laid low for a very long time. But she did continue to receive more grants of land from John and now from King Richard II. So she never really lost that royal favor. And she did reconcile with John at some point, we don't know when. It was probably late 1390s, late 1380s, early 1390s. But they used a lot more caution this time. There's no real record that they're back together. Everything they did was discreet, which is probably a smart move this time around. But during the next 15 years after the Peasants' Revolt, that's really when you see the Beauforts arrive on the scene. So slowly, as they get older, sorry, that's more pictures of the deanery. That is the wooden part. The brick part is the house that she lived in, and you can see Lincoln Cathedral, so you can see how close it is. And then that chapel is from Catherine's time, and that was her private chapel, so she didn't even have to go across the street to go to church. So over the next 15 years, as I said, this is when the four Beaufort children kind of arrive on the scene. And in the mid-1380s, their oldest son, John, enters the confraternity of Lincoln Cathedral with Henry of Bolingbroke and Thomas Swynford. So there's eventual stepbrothers and then half-brothers. Thomas Swynford was, half-brothers with the Beauforts and the Lancasterians. It's a very blended family. There's a lot of different branches. So they continued their ties with Lincoln. That ceremony was conducted at the chapter house, and that is the chapter house. Everything's pretty much still the same as it was in Catherine's time, and you can visit it today. And actually, parliaments have even been out there, so it's a really cool building, but it's kind of attached to Lincoln Cathedral, but it's a separate room. So let's see, at some point in the early 1390s, Catherine enters the household of Mary de Bohun. Now, Mary is the wife of Henry of Bolingbroke. So now she's back on the scene as Henry of Bolingbroke and his wife are beginning to have children and make a family. It seems like she's a governess or some sort of important motherly figure once again. And maybe this was used again as an excuse to keep her close to John. But the ties just continue, and we know that she kept horses at John's houses, enough for her and her children, so they still definitely had a lot of contact. All right, so 1394, Constance dies, and what happens? There's a royal wedding. So this was seismic. Dukes, princes like John did not marry their mistresses. It didn't happen. So everyone thought that he was just going to stay a widow, or that maybe he would marry for wealth a third time because he had promoted himself with both of his first two wives. But no, he announced that he was going to marry Catherine Swynford, his mistress of, at this point, it had been 25 years. Off and on, but probably mostly on, and the mother of his four children who were now pretty much grown. And this is the choir screen at Lincoln Cathedral. It's made of stone. I don't know why it's called a screen, but it sits in front of the choir. And they believe that that is where John and Catherine were married in January 1396. So she's probably about 45 and he's about 55. And they are grandparents and they get married. And this is, if that's not true love, I don't know what is. But the timing is interesting because they didn't get married right away. It was almost 2 years between Constance's death and their marriage. And the reason for this is because John sent for a dispensation to the Pope. Now, why would they need a dispensation? Probably because they're cousins, because everyone's cousins these days, and they marry each other. No, actually, we don't think that they're related at all. It's possible that her dad was related to Philippa, or John's mom, but probably not. The reason why he asked for a papal dispensation was because he had stood as godfather to her child, Blanche, with Hugh, that I mentioned before. And this is the repercussions of him being the godfather. So back then, if you were a child's godparent, you were seen to have a tie with the child's parents as if you're their sibling. So kind of what he's saying is, oh, Catherine could kind of be my sister. We need a dispensation to make sure it's okay. No one would have brought that up. No one probably even remembered that he was the godfather to this little girl. She had probably been dead for a long time, but it was a very canny move because what he's doing is he is getting the Pope's blessing and his seal of approval for the marriage. And he asks for it and he gets it. So, let's see, the Beauforts become legitimate upon their parents' marriage. Now, this is where people sometimes get their history wrong when they say that Henry VII came from an illegitimate line, and that was his claim to the throne. They were illegitimate for a little while, but upon their marriage, there was the papal dispensation, which mattered to some people more even than a lay court of law. But not only that, he went to Parliament and he asked for Parliament to actually officially legitimize the Beauforts. And Richard II, everyone's the same name, did actually legitimize them in 1397. And he had his decision read out in the Parliament of January 1397. So I'll read a quote from it. He says that they should be raised, promoted, elected, assumed, and be admitted to all honors, dignities, preeminences, estates, degrees of offices of public and private whatsoever, as well as temporal or feudal and noble, by whatsoever names they may be designated, whether they be duchies, principalities, earldoms, baronies, or other feats. And he says this should be done as if they were born in lawful matrimony. So his charter that was read out was ratified by Parliament. So in law, they could inherit the throne, they could inherit land. It was as good as if they had been born legitimately. Where the confusion comes up is, a few years later, Henry IV, their half-brother, takes the throne. And about 7 years after that, in 1407, he adds a little note. It's literally a handwritten note to this charter. It doesn't exist anymore, but there's a record that it was handwritten. And it says, except for the royal dignity. And that is next to the part of the charter that I read out. So somebody penciled in, except for the royal dignity. But this version was not ratified by Parliament. So, between Richard II and Henry IV, who was more popular, okay, he was even the better king, okay. But still, Richard's decision actually held the weight of Parliament and was ratified by them, whereas Henry's little pencil note wasn't. So they did still have a legitimate claim to the throne. All right, so her and John have a pretty decent life for the most part for their short time together, but it only lasts about 3 years, and then John dies. And actually, one thing I forgot to mention was going into more detail about how she was the highest ranking lady in England during her time. So Richard's first wife, Anna Bohemia, had died. So when John married Catherine, because he was the highest ranking noble, she was the first lady of England. Everyone else was below her. And some people took issue with this at first because she was low-born, she was foreign, she was a mistress, but they seem to have gotten over it pretty quick because King Richard himself actually really respected her, and by this time he's in his 20s, so everyone kind of followed his suit and realized, okay, you know, she's not that bad. And she actually was assigned by Richard to greet his second wife, who was 7, Isabella of Valois, who was actually Catherine of Valois' older sister, interestingly enough. But Catherine was chosen to greet her and escort her to London. So it kind of shows the esteem that she was held in. So, you know, she kind of became almost the equivalent of a queen. But then John died, and she actually went back to Lincoln, and I kind of think of Lincoln as maybe her safe harbor. I think because of their long ties to Lincoln. So she lays low after this, and we don't know what her feelings or thoughts are. Less than a year later, when her stepson invades England because he had been banished by Richard II, and usurps the throne from her cousin, or I'm sorry, her nephew by marriage. She seems to have kind of wanted to just stay out of it, but this is when Henry openly calls her his mother. His birth mother had died when he was only about 1 year old, and as I said, Catherine was the governess and kind of more present than his actual stepmother, so he always viewed her as his mom, and I think probably as a tie to his birth mother. Let's see. Okay, so she died on May 10th, 1403, and she's buried at Lincoln Cathedral. This is her tomb, and the higher of the two tombs is hers. And the lower one next to it is her daughter, Joan Beaufort. And that's the high altar at Lincoln Cathedral. So it shows you kind of the esteem that she was held in because she was buried in such a prominent place and with a lot of ceremony. And at that time, their second son, Henry, he entered the church, but he had become Bishop of Lincoln, and he was only like 24. So that's a close-up. Her tomb would have been really beautifully decorated, probably with gold and jewels, but one of the Cromwells, either, Thomas and Henry VIII's reign with the dissolution of the monasteries, or the other Cromwell, Oliver, can't remember which one, but one of them stripped all the tombs and did a lot of damage to Lincoln Cathedral, and that includes Catherine. But we are actually lucky that her tomb even still exists. John Founds doesn't. He was buried with Blanche at the old St. Paul's Cathedral, and that was burned down. But you can still go and see them today and see their daughter, Joan. So I don't know if anyone here is a fan of historical fiction, but if you are, I personally recommend Anya Seton's Katherine. And it's a very popular book, especially in the UK, but also in the US. It was written in 1954, and it's kind of a classic of historical fiction, but it's about Katherine Swynford. And this is how she actually comes to a lot of people. They know her through this depiction. It infers a lot of things because we don't know a lot of the truth, but I recommend it as an enjoyable read. In the background, I think that was supposed to be the Savoy Palace. In the background, the tall white thing, that's probably supposed to be Catherine. And I had to include these other copies of the book because it's like, really? And that's why she was called a seductress and an unspeakable concubine. And yes, 600 years later, she's still portrayed that way. And I don't know John of Gaunt is about to behead somebody or what's going on in the background, but yeah, go for this version. That's the first edition. And so why is Katherine important? As I mentioned, you'll see the Beaufort portcullises at pretty much any palace that you visit, any cathedral. But I was lucky enough to be in England this past June for our society study day, and went to a few different places. And one place I went was Westminster Abbey, and this is the tomb of Elizabeth I and Mary I. A lot of people forget that Mary is buried there, poor thing. And we look up, and what do you know? But that is Katherine Swynford's badge, the one in the center. So her badge is the red shield with the 3 gold Katherine wheels, and those wheels come from St. Catherine, and that was her badge that she adopted as Duchess of Lancaster. So I was like, why is her shield on the tomb of Elizabeth I? Like, this is really a high place for her. So I wrote to someone at the Abbey, and they were kind enough to get back to me. And it turns out that this canopy was erected in the reign of James I, and it includes the shields of Katherine and John and a lot of the Beauforts. And so as early as the early Stuarts, they are harkening back to their roots that come from Katherine Swynford. Same thing happened at Hampton Court. This is in the Great Hall. The stained glass window there, it is Victorian, but even in the Victorian era, they still were paying tribute to John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford, which is interesting, based on the moorings of the time. So, real quick. So if you want to see the, I have one more slide in here, sorry. There it is, I skipped over it. Okay, so how is she connected to Henry VII? So this is just a summary, but their 4 children were John, Henry, Joan, and Thomas. Thomas didn't have any kids that survived. Henry was a cardinal and probably didn't or shouldn't have had any children. Joan Beaufort, as we heard earlier, she actually had 14 children, and her husband had 8 before that, and she had 2 before that, so they had 24 kids together. And I think they all lived to adulthood. So that's how the Nevilles became powerful. That's a whole other thing. And their youngest daughter was Cecily Neville, who we heard about earlier. She, of course, is the mother of Edward IV and Richard III. So that's how Katherine is the great-grandmother of 2 kings. But again, it is through their first son, John, Earl of Somerset, that Henry VII stakes his claim to the English throne. John, Earl of Somerset, all the Johns, did have several sons. Somehow they all failed to have children. His son John became Duke of Somerset, had 1 daughter, as we heard earlier, Margaret Beaufort. Margaret Beaufort had 1 son, Henry VII. And so that is how Henry VII got his claim to the English throne. And he used, of course, his father's name, Tudor, but it's actually through the Beauforts that he lays his claim. And historian Nathan Amin argues that the Wars of the Roses were more between the House of Beaufort and the House of York than the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Because when you think about it, Henry VI was poor guy, but an inept king. Whether that was because of mental illness or that was just his nature. There weren't really a lot of actual Lancastrian people out there fighting. It was the Beauforts, and the Beauforts were really disliked by the Yorks. And in the end, it was the House of Beaufort that won and that claimed the throne. So briefly, I just want to tell you I am the proud chairwoman of the Katherine Swynford Society. So if you're interested in finding out more, I have flyers up here, and Heather said that she will make them available to our online attendees. We have a cool journal that we put out twice a year. We do study days once a year. So please let me know if you're interested. Come talk to me.